are looking at the rock churches of Ethiopia. Are they the eighth wonder of the world? We're about to find out. They're certainly nothing short of amazing, and that's because they're not built of stone, they're actually hewn into solid bedrock. And in Ethiopia, there are hundreds of them. Some date to the 4th century AD, many are hidden away in difficult to access places, and visiting them, I'm told, can be quite the adventure. And Francis is going to show us some of Ethiopia's most beautiful landscapes in the process of taking us to those churches tonight. Francis Williams has spent 7 years in Ethiopia between 1968 and 74 as a lecturer in geology at Addis Ababa University. She fell in love with the country at that stage and has subsequently visited many times. Could you please give a very warm RGSSA welcome to Francis Williams.
Because I've got lots of exciting things to tell you about the rock churches of Ethiopia, which, like Lee said, are amazing, and it's an awful pity if you miss anything. So the people at the very back, can you hear okay? Well, I'm going to start by telling you about my very first visit to an Ethiopian rock church, which was way back in 1972. As Lee said, I was a lecturer in geology at Addis Ababa University, and a colleague from the history department asked me if I'd like to accompany her on a visit to the rock-hewn churches of Tigray, which is way up in the north of Ethiopia. And at that stage, these particular rock-hewn churches were virtually unknown to Europeans. Of course, the Ethiopians knew all about them. So, of course, I said yes. And it did turn out to be one of the most wonderful, if not the scariest, experiences of my life. So, Tigray, up in the north of Ethiopia, is one of the most beautiful regions of Ethiopia, and it's got a very special type of landscape, a sort of wild western landscape of rock pillars and towers and flat-topped hills. And on that trip, we visited a number of churches, but there was one that stood way out above all other, and that was the church of Abuna Yamata Gu, which was located, oh, that's better, about a third of the way up that rock pillar. Well, Ivy mentioned casually, she said it's a bit of a scramble, and I should have suspected something when she herself opted not to make the ascent, but to sit at the bottom and wait for the rest of us. Well, the ascent basically involved 3 stages. Each one was more terrifying than the last. It started off by a scramble up a vertical rock face, with just handholds in the rock to get up. Well, our Ethiopian guide shot up with no trouble at all, and they very kindly let down a rope to assist us soft foreigners. The second was crossing this bridge, which is made of 3 precariously balanced and none too solid-looking logs placed over what seemed like a bottomless precipice. I didn't dare look down to see how deep this thing was. Well, all this was bad enough, but the worst thing that nearly got me altogether was the ledge. And this was a ledge about a metre or so wide, sloping slightly outwards towards the precipice, with a precipice on the left and a smooth rock face on the right. It looked like a drop of about 1,000 metres. I found out later it was about 300 metres, but no matter, was certain instant death if one fell. And I've got no head for heights, and even then in my younger days I didn't have a head for heights at all. But anyway, somehow I made it and got to this little, it's a little crack. I don't know, I can't see there. A little tiny crack in the rock, which was actually the entrance to the church. So we crawled in, and this made the whole thing worthwhile, because the church was a cavern carved out into the rock, not a cave, but one actually that had been carved, and it was absolutely covered with the most beautiful paintings. It was probably only about 10 metres or so in diameter. This one just shows the painting on the ceiling, which is a picture which shows a mixture of apostles and Ethiopian saints. But the whole walls were covered with these paintings as well. And the priest held up a candle for us to see them. And it's not known when the church was excavated. The paintings were thought to date from somewhere around the 15th century, and they were just so beautifully preserved because of the enormous thickness of rock on top of them, no danger from water seepage or anything. Anyway, the whole thing was so beautiful and amazing, it very nearly made me forget my terror at the thought of the return trip. But somehow it did manage to get down again. And when we got down, we asked the Ethiopian guide, I said, do Ethiopians ever go up there? He said, oh, yes. There are services every Sunday and Holy Day, and mothers even take up their babies to be baptized. And later on, many years later on, I actually read in the Lonely Planet Guide a warning that the ascent to this church is extremely difficult and dangerous and should on no account be attempted by anyone who has the slightest tendency to vertigo. And I'm so glad I didn't read that beforehand, because I would never have dreamed of going, and I would have missed out on just an amazing experience. And I guess that whole experience and the whole trip and the other churches we visited gave me a real love and interest in those rock churches and in the Tigrayan region in general. Unfortunately, at the moment, just after my last visit in 2019, first of all, COVID broke out, and then directly after that, a civil war broke out with the Tigrayans fighting against the Ethiopian government. And ever since then, it's not settled down, and it's not safe to go there, which is sort of very sad. Anyway, that was just to put you in the picture. So just to see where we are. That's a topographic map of Africa, and Ethiopia's over. Yeah, I don't. I'm pressing the wrong button. There. Just on the northeastern side, in a little region which is called the Horn of Africa, which consists of Somalia, Djibouti, a bit of Sudan, and Eritrea. As you can see, it's a very mountainous country. Most of it's more than 2,000 metres above sea level. And it's this fact that it's kept it sort of separate from the rest of Africa and enabled it to keep its own monarchy, to avoid being colonised like the rest of Africa was, and to retain its own very special culture and its own very special type of Christianity. And it's full of amazing things. And of course, one of the most interesting is the rock churches. The church which I just showed you, of Buna Yamatagu, is there where the arrow's pointing, right way up in the north. Well, obviously, there has to be Christianity in order to have churches. And Christianity was introduced to Ethiopia around 333 AD and is one of the oldest Christian countries in the world. And it adopted Christianity very rapidly and very fervently, and a strong tradition of monasticism, which is partly a lot to do with the rock churches, was adopted afterwards, and it continues to this day. There were Muslim invasions from the south in the 15th century, which actually did almost at the time cover the whole country, but it was very fortunately repulsed. And after that, Islam infiltrated gradually and fairly peacefully, mostly into the southern part of the country. And currently, about 60% of Ethiopian Christians, about 40% of them are Muslims. And very roughly speaking, the Christian area is the highland area in the northwest, and the Muslim area is the lowland area in the southeast. And the majority of Ethiopian Christians belong to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Well, there's a lot of churches in Ethiopia. Almost, well, every village would have its own church. And a traditional Ethiopian church, there are many different designs, but this is the traditional sort, which is a circular church, generally with a thatched roof or a tin roof, and with a cross on the top, generally decorated with ostrich eggs. And even the sort of what I might call normal churches are often located in places which are quite difficult to access. And I think the idea is that it should be difficult to access somewhere as important as a church where God is residing. And also it's a high place, so it's closer to heaven, obviously. So this shows the congregation coming back down the mountain after the church service of this particular church, which is called Asama Mariam. The names of Ethiopian churches are usually twofold. One of them is the saint that the church is dedicated to, in this case Mary or Mariam, and the other one is the name of the village that the church serves. So it will be the village of Asama. But as well as these or normal churches, there's an enormous number, probably hundreds, of rock churches. And by a rock church, as Lee mentioned, it's one that's not built out of stones and bricks like a normal church, but it's actually hewn into the rock, into the bedrock itself. And we'll see how that's done. And being a geologist, of course, I was interested in the relation between the churches and the rock, because obviously if you're going to have a rock church, you need the right type of rock for it. You need a rock that's going to be reasonably easy to carve into, but you also want one that's going to be strong and durable and hopefully last indefinitely. So there's a geological map of Ethiopia. You don't have to worry about the details. People are always frightened of geological maps because they're complicated. But just notice that the two groups of rock churches, because although the rock churches are scattered over the highlands, by far the most of them are concentrated in those two regions in the north, which I've called the Tigray group and the Lalibela group. And just looking at the geological map, you can see that the Tigray group are in that yellow area, which is mainly sedimentary rocks like sandstone and limestone, whereas the other ones, the Lalibela group, are located in the brown area, which is volcanic rocks, mainly basalt. And this leads to two very, very different styles of churches. So we'll start by going back to Tigray and look at some of its amazing hidden churches. So I don't know whether you can spot the hidden church in that picture. It's, oops, sorry. It's there. But actually, that's not the church itself. That's just a facade that's been built over the entrance to the church. And the church itself, this is one called Mariam Kiat, is hollowed out into a cavern behind the facade. This is a very tiny church, but it does show all the features of a typical Ethiopian, typical Tigrayan rock church. This red curtain, oh, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. The red curtain, which you can see over on the left there, is typical of any Ethiopian church. It hides what's called the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies is a place where they keep what's called the taboo. And the taboo is a piece of, it's usually wood, sometimes stone, but it represents the stone on which Moses wrote down the commandments which were given by God. And every Ethiopian church has a taboo, and nobody's allowed to see it except the priests. So that's hidden behind there. The church is built, the pillars are just left in place while the rest of the church is hollowed out around them. In this case, there's only one or two pillars in the church. And this open space, which you can see in the picture, would be where the priests do their singing and chanting and dancing. You can see their musical instruments in the little alcove behind them. And because it's such a small church, and it's actually the case in a lot of Ethiopian churches, the congregation doesn't go into the church, but it stands around outside and just bows and prays and listens to what's going on. So there's at least, well over 100 rock churches like that in Tigray. And this is a satellite photo, and each of those red dots indicates a rock church. As you can see, there's a lot of them. There's actually 72 on this map, and that's probably less than half of the actual ones that are there. And as I mentioned before, they weren't known to Europeans and before about the 1960s, so there's probably lots that haven't been mapped properly yet. The reason they seem to be arranged in lines is because they're built into sandstone ridges. Sandstone is the most appropriate rock for hewing them into, and ridges are the most appropriate place for putting them because they're high up and difficult to get to. So not only is sandstone a good sort of rock for hewing a church into, it also makes this very special kind of landscape, this special Tigrayan type of landscape of pillars and flat-topped hills and spires. And the little diagram which I've put up there shows roughly how it happens. You get rivers flowing over what was originally a flat area. They cut down into it, they gradually meander, widen, the land gets cut back and gets sort of carved up into those spires and pinnacles. And they're full of steep rock faces, like we saw before, and cracks and crevices, which are really good places for putting rock churches and for making them hidden and difficult to get to. This is a sandstone ridge called Geralta Mountain, and even this part of it is home to at least half a dozen rock churches. And the one we're going to visit, which I'll show you now, is located there. Now, it's 600 meters from top to bottom, and the sides of the mountain are vertical. And of course, the first question comes to mind is, how does one get up? Is it going to be another Abuna Yamata? Well, thankfully, it isn't, because geology here has provided a way up to what's called a dike. And molten basalt lava has come up through a crack in the sandstone. And because the lava is very hot and molten, it's baked the layer of the sandstone that it's stepped through, making a very hard layer. And then the dike itself is eroded away. So it's created a natural passageway, which is really useful. And not only that, as the basalt hardens, it hardens into sort of six-sided columns. So it makes even a little staircase to go up. And actually that is very steep. It looks kind of horizontal, but that was really quite steep going up. After that, it's followed by another cliff scramble, but not nearly so bad as the one we saw before. Unfortunately, there were two different ways up. There was the men's route and the which one of my colleagues took, as you can see, and you can guess that I probably decided to take the much easier women's route. And like the other church we saw, it's built behind a facade, which is probably built much, much later than the church itself. Why they put facades there or who did it, nobody really knows. But when you go behind that facade, you come into this wonderful church, and it's very hard to describe what it's like going into an Ethiopian rock church, because you'll be out in the hot sunshine. There'd be birds singing, people talking, and all of a sudden it's completely silent. It's cool, and it's generally pretty dark as well, because the lighting is usually only a few little light bulbs or even just a candle held by the priest. This particular church, Mariam Korkor, is very special, first of all, because it's so big. It's far bigger than the other little church we saw before, Kiryat Mariam. It's about 10 metres wide, and it's hewn back into the rock about 25 metres, and everything's perfectly crafted. And the pillars are just there, left in place while the rock is hewn out around them. And you can imagine how tricky it might be for the hewers. Supposing you hewed out a bit that was supposed to be a pillar, you would wreck the whole thing, and there was no way of fixing it. You couldn't put it back again. So it's very clever the way they did it. It's very hard to photograph them because the pillars get in the way. You can see that the bottom part of the pillars there are very worn away, and this is due to worshippers who come and touch them and kiss them, and whether they might stop people doing that, because if the pillar wears away at the bottom, then obviously you're going to have problems with the supporting the roof. So just to show you a bit better idea, this is a plan of that church done by a lady called Ruth Plant, who's a friend of my other friend, Ivy Pierce, who actually made a study of the churches back in the 1960s and drew plans of a lot of them. And you can see from the plan how complex it is, how many pillars there are, how many cupolas, all perfectly formed. There's nothing sort of rough about it at all. They're all smooth and perfect. And covered with paintings. In this church, the paintings have faded a bit because it hasn't got a very high roof and it's very well used, so they become worn away. So you can imagine it would be tricky to make a church like that. What sort of tools they used must have been just chisels and hammers. You can often see the markings on the walls of where they chipped away. The paintings are faded, but they're very interesting. Paintings in Ethiopian churches are always stories from the Bible or stories of Ethiopian saints. And I like this one showing the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, with not one but two serpents each, telling Adam and Eve, oh, eat the apple, eat the apple. And just to give you a better idea, this is another church. It's quite near to that first one, but it was easier to photograph, and it gives you a better idea of what the interior looks like. It's just like a normal, walking into a normal parish church with pillars, cupolas, altars at the end. And this one had very nice paintings. You can see along the bottom, starting from the left, the Roman soldiers, very gleeful, crucifying Jesus on the cross. The women putting him in the tomb. On the right, Caesar and his soldiers celebrating the crucifixion by drinking Ethiopian honey wine. And then along the top, there are some martyrs, the stoning of St. Sebastian and the martyrdom of St. Stephen. And in Ethiopian paintings, the traditional ones, bad people are always shown in profile, and good people are always shown full face. So you can see, for example, the Roman soldiers obviously are bad, whereas Christ obviously is good. Caesar and all his colleagues are bad. So you can easily tell who are the baddies and who are the goodies just by looking at the faces. The picture at the top right, he's an Ethiopian saint called Saint Tecla, a very well-known saint. The legend is that he stood on one leg for 7 years praying, and the other leg fell off. And in return for only having one leg, the angels gave him 6 pairs of wings to make up for it. Well, in Church bells are often made of rock as well. This one's just made of 2 pieces of basalt, and they're rung by hitting another stone, and they make a perfect musical interval chime. Unfortunately, they've been largely replaced now by loudspeakers, which sort of bellow out across the countryside and completely ruin the whole effect. And they usually keep these ones, I think, just to show visitors. And very near to that church, Mariam Korkor, there's another little church called Daniel Korkor. And to my dismay, it was accessed by another of those awful rock ledges which Ethiopian Christians seem partial to. And you can see on the top left-hand picture our guide standing precariously close to the edge, beckoning me to come along, give it a go. And then me clinging, terrified to the guide on one side and the rock wall on the other. And if you had the courage to look around, there's the most fantastic view of rock cliffs and the surrounding plain. Anyway, it's a church. It must have the smallest entrance of any church at all. My little friend could hardly get in. But inside, like the other churches, is beautifully decorated, very small. It's only a few meters in diameter, with rather worn-out paintings. And unfortunately, part of the roof had fallen away and damaged the roof painting. I like that painting of King David playing his harp. Well, these churches in Tigray, there are so many of them, and nobody knows who made them, who dug them out, why. Why did they put them in such extraordinary places? Why were they hidden away? And why were some of them so difficult to get to? There's a lot of theories and put forward, but none of those questions have really been answered. There's no historical records to explain it. But if you ask the local people or the priests who built them and when, they'll immediately answer Abraha and Atzbah in the 4th century. Well, Abraha and Atzbah, whom you can see pictured there in rather a modern painting, they're supposed to be twin kings who ruled Ethiopia in the 4th century when Christianity was first introduced. But historical record don't have any record of such people. The king at that time had a different name. He was called Ezana. So whether Abraha and Atzbah were real or figments of the imagination, no one knows, but they're very well held, and they have a very beautiful church dedicated to them, which actually happens to be one of the very easiest ones to get to. You just have to walk up that little slope and get to them. Well, that just gives a little overview of just a couple of Tigray's churches. I haven't been to anything like all of them. I've maybe been to about a dozen or so. I'd love to go to more. It's just not been time or opportunity. They're all different, and I never get tired of visiting them. I could spend the whole talk on Tigray churches, but we'd better move on to the second group of rock churches, which is the Lalibela group. And as you can see, and as I mentioned before, they're in quite a different geological setting to the Tigray churches. The Tigray churches were excavated into sandstone, and they were excavated horizontally, sort of like a cave, whereas the Lalibela churches are located in volcanic rocks, and they're excavated vertically. This is the town of Lalibela. It's about 60 kilometres south of Tigray, where we were before. It's vastly grown since I first visited in about 1968, when it was just a village. You had to either walk or go by horseback to get there. And that little area there contains 11 rock churches, and they were declared a World Heritage site in 1978 because of their historical and cultural value. The town of Lalibela is named after a king called Lalibela, who was supposed to reign from approximately 1181 to 1221 AD. And that was long before Ethiopia as such existed. I mean, Ethiopia as such didn't exist until very much later. There was lots of little kingdoms. And the kingdom that Lalibela reigned over, at most, was probably that little area of the highlands that I've outlined there in white. Anyway, the legend was that in a dream, God summoned Lalibela to heaven and commanded him to build a new Jerusalem out of rock. Well, Lalibela, of course, wanted to obey, but unfortunately, the country he reigned over was formed of basalt, which is a really hard rock and would be very, very difficult to excavate. But either he or whoever did build the churches was quite smart, and they found that in the basalt there were small patches of a much smaller volcanic rock called tuff, which is thrown out by explosive eruptions as the basalt is flowing. So they used these to excavate the churches, and they excavated them in a very unique way. And this is how they excavated the Lalibela churches. First of all, you dig a trench to isolate a block of rock. And it's not just a little block of rock. I mean, this one's about 20 metres across and 30 metres back and 11 metres high. Having done that, then you hollow out the inside of it to form the church, a little bit like they hollowed out the Tigray churches. And in the same way, to leave pillars, dig around it, and cupolas and little windows. Unfortunately, it's very hard to get pictures of these churches because about 15 years ago, UNESCO decided they had to be protected, being a World Heritage Site. And they did it by building the most incredibly ugly shelters to cover them, which makes it impossible to see the churches properly, takes away the whole beauty and atmosphere of the place, and makes it very, very difficult to photograph them. So the bottom left-hand picture shows a picture, I had to actually get it from a book, taken of that very same church before the shelters were constructed. And this particular church, they say it's the largest rock-hewn church in the world. And I don't know what it is, I haven't heard of any that are larger. And it's got an amazing design. It's the only one that's got pillars all the way around the outside, as well as lots of pillars inside. And this shows the volcanic tuff that they were excavated in. And my husband there is actually pointing to a volcanic bomb, which is a lump of lava that was thrown out during the eruption and was solidified in that cylindrical shape. But I've heard from one member of the audience here tonight that that's not the little bit interesting. What is really interesting about this picture is this little cavity over here, which I don't know whether you can see a few hands and feet poking out, but that contains the skeletons of pilgrims that either came to Lalibela to die or else had their remains brought there. Because it's believed that if you die in such a holy place as Lalibela, or a second best if you have your remains brought there, it's a surefire way of getting to heaven. So as you go around Lalibela and also the other churches, you find these little alcoves full of skeletons and bits of arms and legs and things of people who have, really want to go to heaven. This is an attempt to show some of the churches. There's 11 of them altogether. Some of them are much more elaborate than others. These are the more elaborate ones. the Metane Alam, which we saw at the beginning, and Emmanuel and Mariam, they're sort of truly monolithic churches, which means they're only attached to the rock at the bottom. Only their bases are attached to the bedrock. Whereas this one is a little bit different. Libanos, which is over on the bottom left, is attached to the top as well. And in a way, that might have been harder to excavate because you'd have to dig right into the rock and go around the back and come out on the other side. But inside, they're all very similar. They're pillars, all left there. This is just an attempt. It's very hard, again, to photograph the interiors and show how incredibly beautiful that they really are. A photograph just can't do them justice at all. But you can imagine how hard it would be if people would be working in darkness. There'd be a large number of people working. Somebody would have to design and coordinate the thing, whether they had an architect or how it was done. I mean, the Ethiopians say it was all done by angels, but it must have been done by people. How they managed to design it, organise the workforce. That's bad enough organising a workforce today to build a house. But trying to organise to build beautiful churches like that would be very difficult. And the churches are arranged in three groups, actually. There are two groups of, one has 6 churches in it, the other one has 4 churches in it, of the two groups. And between them runs a dry creek, which is called the River Jordan. And somewhere in the courtyard of one of the churches is also a Mount Ararat, which is a bit geographically strange, but it's there. And within each group, the churches are connected by a whole maze of tunnels and bridges. No idea why, whether it's to make it difficult for invaders or something to get through. But it makes it really exciting to explore them because you can go down a tunnel in one church and come up through a tunnel and they're in the next church. And also some rather rickety looking bridges. So there's those two groups of churches, and there's a third group which only consists of one church, so it's not really exactly a group. And the legend is that King Lalibela built the 10 churches in the two groups, but he'd completely forgotten to dedicate any of them to St. George. And St. George is the patron saint of Ethiopia. And he was really cross about this. And he came galloping up on his white horse, as you can see in the picture over on the left, to scold Lalibela for this awful mistake. So to make up for this very serious omission, Lalibela built the most beautiful church of all, built in the shape of a cross, and it's the one you see most on tourist pictures of Lalibela. It is very, very beautiful. It's not so beautiful inside, it's very plain, but the outside is just exquisite. And it was also carefully designed with some little drains at the top, and it's the only one that's not covered by one of those horrible canopies. Anyway, St. George came to inspect the building, and you can see on the rock wall beneath those little buoys, there are some dents in the rock. And these are supposed to be the footprints of King George's horse when he came to inspect the work. And presumably he was happy with it. Hopefully he was anyway. Well, like the Tigray churches, the Lalibela churches are completely alive. They're used all the time. They're not historical relics. They're very much living. They have services every day. And as you walk around them, you'll see the priests sitting, reading their books or praying or chanting, and they'll bring out their treasures for a small donation to show to visitors. And during festivals and holy days, people come. It's the most holy place in Ethiopia. And for festivals, particularly Easter and Christmas, people come from all over the country. They'll walk for days to come there to celebrate. The biggest celebration is Christmas at Lalibela. And I was lucky enough when I was living there to spend one Christmas at Lalibela, which was a wonderful experience because the priests sing and chant all night and the people sit around and listen. The downside was having to sit all night. It's very cold and extremely uncomfortable. But the atmosphere was just wonderful with all the singing. The priests are tireless when they do their dancing and chanting. And then in the morning, just as the sun rose, everyone sort of shouted, "Christ is born," or its equivalent in Amharic. And the atmosphere was just amazing. So it was worth being half frozen all night up in the mountains. It was a very beautiful experience. So those churches have been there for about 800 years, but in about the past 60 years, they've suffered more deterioration than they have during their whole lifetime due to several things. Roof damage has probably always been a problem, and that's why they erected these canopies. But that's not really the biggest problem. The biggest problem's coming from underneath, because when the constructors built the churches, they were very clever engineers, and they built a very intricate drainage system to divert water away from the bottom of the churches. And you can see the damage to the base of Emmanuel Church there. It's eroding away because the water is just accumulating at the base and attacking it from the ground up. And another big problem is that Lalibela used to be a tiny village, miles from anywhere. You could only get there by horseback or by walking. Now, as you saw from the previous pictures, it's a big town, and there's a big main road that goes straight through the middle of it, not very far from where the churches are. So, of course, there's vibrations and cracks in the churches are beginning to open up because the tough rock that they're made of is really a little bit soft. It's not quite as hard as sandstone, and it does tend to crumble. And it is, I think it may have been the Italians put up some things to measure how much the cracks are widening. So what can be done about that? I'm not sure what that... And also the number of visitors. There's no visitors now because of the war, but before the war, visitors were beginning to know about it, and they were getting quite a lot of people coming, walking around. So that's a problem. And of course, one of the questions people always ask about Lalibela is who built those churches and how long did it take? Was it Lalibela who built them himself, like God told him to? And as it's shown in this picture, the legend goes that men built during the daytime, but at night time they were replaced by angels who completed 7 times the amount of work that the men did overnight. And the whole thing only took about a week. And at the other end of the scale, somebody, I'm not sure who it was, calculated it would have taken a workforce of something like 40,000 people, 20 years, 24 years to build them. So, but just recently there's been a few attempts by various people to recreate a kind of Lalibela to try and show that it may not have been as difficult as people thought. And one of these, quite recently, I think from about 2010, a priest called Gabriel Mascal Tessima, single-handed, decided he would build what's called Dagamawi, which in the way means a second or an imitation Lalibela. Not all that far from Lalibela itself, about 60 kilometres away, to see how long it would take. And I've never seen this because I didn't even know about it. I can't wait to see it. I'd love to see it and see how he's doing it. So I've had to take my information from Google. And it does show that it's on a lot smaller scale than Lalibela, maybe only about a half or a third the size. The buildings are smaller. But what annoyed me was none of the sites I looked at said what kind of rock it is, because that makes a lot of difference to how fast you can excavate a church. And to me, it looks very white. It looks like volcanic ash, which is a very soft rock. And there is a lot of it around in that area, which would be much easier to hew. Anyway, it's a really interesting experiment, and I'll wait to see it. I started off by telling you about the first Ethiopian church I visited, and I'll end by telling you about what up to now is, unfortunately, the last one I visited until the country becomes possible to visit again. And this was in 2019. 2020, of course, we had COVID. Nobody could go anywhere. Then the Civil War started, and it hasn't been possible to visit since. So this church is quite special. It's near Lalibela, and it's a Lalibela style of church. It's about 30 kilometres from Lalibela town. It's called Bilbala Georgis, and it's a bit off the beaten track. It's not very much visited, and it's not in very good shape either. It's deteriorating and crumbling. They have tried putting one of those shelters over it. But in its day, it must have been very beautiful. The interesting thing to see, there it is, that inside the porch, which is a whole hive of bees. And this church is full of bees buzzing. The whole church is full of buzzing bees. This is the special thing about it. They're Ethiopian bees. They don't sting, fortunately. But they're very important in the story of Lalibela, because what part of the legend goes that when Lalibela was born, a cloud of bees came and surrounded him, and they didn't sting him, and his mother took this as a sign that he was going to be a great king. So bees play a very important part in Ethiopia in general, and they are protected. And their honey is used for making an ointment, and also a very special kind of honey wine called tej, which is quite potent and very, very tasty. I'm very fond of tej. Anyway, unfortunately, it looks a bit like orange juice. And if you're not aware of it, you sort of take tumbles of it, and then all of a sudden you suddenly find you can't stand up anymore. It didn't happen to me, but it has happened to other geologists who've come for conferences and not been aware of the dangers. Anyway, we went to Bilbao Georgis, and it was a Sunday, and the service had just finished, and the priest came to show us some of his treasures. And they had some very beautiful treasures in that church. With because Ethiopians have huge processional crosses, which they use when they walk into church and on special religious occasions. And he brought out all these things to show us, which were really beautiful. And as you can see, he's a severe-looking man, very, very serious. He was somewhat taciturn and forbidding. But then, after the service, when he went outside, he'd finished showing us around, he invited us to join him and the other church dignitaries to drink, unfortunately not tej, but another Ethiopian drink called tala, which is a kind of beer. And he completely changed. His face became smiles and wrinkles. And we spent a really convivial half hour or so, which became even more convivial. You can see the barrel at the back in blue. That's full of tala. And as the level of the tala went down, everything became more convivial. Eventually we went and left the priests and so on to it. Anyway, so it's really hard to put into words about the rock churches because they're so special and so amazing. And a Portuguese priest called Francisco Alvarez visited Ethiopia in 1520, and as far as it's known, he was the first non-Ethiopian to see the Lalibela churches. And he was so amazed that he ran out of words. He said, "I'm weary of writing more about these buildings, because it seems to me I shall not be believed if I write more. And because, regarding what I've already written, they may blame me for untruth." So I think that sums it up really quite well. So thank you. That's it.